After World War II, the United States government faced a debt burden over 100% of our entire economy. Instead of raising taxes or cutting spending, they chose a different path. They deliberately kept interest rates below inflation for half the years between 1945 and 1980, averaging negative 3 to 4% real returns during what economists call liquidation years. The same pattern played out across the world. Britain did it with debt over 200% of GDP. Advanced economies everywhere used this exact mechanism to quietly steal wealth from ordinary savers and transfer it straight to government coffers. And here's what should terrify you. Right now, in 2025, with $35 trillion in government debt, every single tool of financial repression is being deployed again. Your savings account, your pension, your government bonds are all designed to lose purchasing power while the government pays back its massive debts with your cheaper dollars. Subscribe if you want to understand exactly how this wealth transfer machine operates and why your financial future depends on recognizing the pattern before it's too late. The United States government has already implemented a comprehensive plan to quietly confiscate tens of trillions of dollars from ordinary savers without passing a single visible tax increase or announcing a headline-grabbing bailout program. This mechanism operates through a sophisticated economic strategy known as financial repression, a deliberately engineered system that transfers wealth from individual savers directly into government coffers while maintaining the illusion of market-driven financial policies. Financial repression represents far more than an abstract economic theory buried in academic journals. It constitutes a documented historical pattern whereby governments systematically reduce their debt burdens by maintaining interest rates below the rate of inflation, creating negative real interest rates that steadily erode the purchasing power of savings accounts, government bonds, and fixed income investments. The mechanics of this wealth transfer system revolve around three critical concepts that every saver must understand. Real interest rates represent the difference between nominal interest rates and the inflation rate, revealing the actual purchasing power gained or lost on investments. When governments maintain nominal interest rates at 2% while inflation runs at 4%, savers experience a negative 2% real return, meaning their money loses purchasing power every single year. Financial repression describes the deliberate policy framework through which governments channel funds to themselves via controlled interest rate environments, regulatory mandates that force financial institutions to hold government debt, and captive domestic audiences prevented from seeking higher returns elsewhere. Debt liquidation occurs when governments reduce the real value of their outstanding debt obligations by repaying creditors with currency that has been deliberately devalued through inflationary policies. Historical evidence demonstrates that financial repression emerged as the preferred alternative to outright debt default, following periods of massive government borrowing. After World War II, the United States faced a debt-to-GDP ratio exceeding 100%, while the United Kingdom confronted debt levels surpassing 200% of their entire economic output. Rather than implementing politically devastating tax increases or admitting financial insolvency through default, both nations adopted sophisticated financial repression strategies that operated largely beneath public awareness. Between 1945 and 1980, advanced economies maintained negative real interest rates for approximately half of all years, with typical real returns averaging negative 3 to 4% during what economists classify as debt liquidation periods. These policies created a systematic wealth transfer mechanism that moved resources from private savers to government balance sheets without requiring legislative approval or public debate. Banks found themselves required or heavily incentivized to purchase government bonds rather than seeking higher yield alternatives, while capital controls prevented individual savers from moving their money to foreign markets offering superior returns. Interest rate ceilings and central bank interventions ensured that government borrowing costs remained artificially suppressed, even as inflation steadily reduced the real value of outstanding debt obligations. The consequences of financial repression extend far beyond abstract economic statistics into the concrete financial reality faced by millions of ordinary citizens. Individuals relying on savings accounts, certificates of deposit, government bonds, and pension plans discover their purchasing power systematically eroded through policies designed to prioritize government debt reduction over saver protection. This mechanism operates as an invisible tax that requires no congressional votes, generates no newspaper headlines, and maintains plausible deniability while accomplishing the same wealth redistribution goals as direct taxation. The current economic environment displays every characteristic of renewed financial repression implementation, positioning today's savers as the designated funding source for government debt relief through the deliberate suppression of real returns on traditional safe investments. The conclusion of World War II left the United States government confronting an unprecedented financial crisis that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between savers and the state for the next 4 decades. Government debt had exploded to levels exceeding 120% of the entire national economy, creating a burden so massive that conventional debt management strategies appeared wholly inadequate. Traditional approaches would have required either catastrophic tax increases that could destroy economic recovery or outright debt default that would shatter international confidence in American financial institutions. Instead, government officials and Federal Reserve policymakers collaborated to implement a sophisticated wealth extraction system that would operate largely outside public awareness, while systematically transferring resources from private savers to government coffers. The financial repression framework implemented during this period relied on 4 interconnected mechanisms that created a captive audience for government debt, while suppressing real returns on private savings. Government authorities enforced artificially low nominal interest rates through Federal Reserve policies that maintained long-term rates at approximately 2.5% throughout much of the 1940s and 1950s, regardless of underlying economic conditions or inflation pressures. Capital flow restrictions prevented American savers from seeking higher returns in foreign markets, effectively trapping domestic wealth within the controlled interest rate environment. Regulatory directives required banks, insurance companies, and pension funds to hold substantial portions of their assets in government securities rather than pursuing higher-yield private sector investments. Simultaneously, monetary policies deliberately permitted moderate inflation to persist, ensuring that the combination of suppressed interest rates and rising prices would generate consistently negative real returns for savers. The mathematical precision of this wealth transfer mechanism becomes clear when examining the real interest rate calculations that defined the post-war financial landscape. During the most aggressive liquidation years between 1945 and 1980, American savers experienced real interest rates averaging negative 3 to 4% annually, meaning that government bondholders and bank depositors lost purchasing power at a rate of 3 to 4 cents on every dollar each year. The Federal Reserve maintained rigid control over the yield curve through direct intervention in bond markets, while regulatory agencies prevented financial institutions from offering competitive returns that might undermine government financing operations. Capital controls ensured that wealthy individuals could not escape these suppressed returns by investing overseas, creating a domestic financial system where government debt enjoyed privileged access to national savings at below-market rates. The consequences of this systematic policy framework extended far beyond government balance sheet improvements into the fundamental restructuring of American wealth distribution. The debt liquidation effect, generated through negative real interest rates, transferred approximately 3 to 4% of national economic output from private savers to government accounts annually during peak implementation years, representing hundreds of billions in today's purchasing power, moved from individual savings accounts and pension funds directly into federal debt reduction. Bank depositors, government bond holders, and insurance policy beneficiaries discovered their real wealth steadily eroding, despite receiving regular interest payments that appeared reasonable in nominal terms, but failed to maintain purchasing power against deliberate inflationary policies. This post-war financial repression system operated as a stealth taxation mechanism that required no congressional authorization, generated no public protests, and maintained the appearance of market-driven interest rates, while systematically favoring government debt service over private saver protection. The success of this approach in reducing government debt burdens without triggering political backlash established financial repression as the preferred alternative to both tax increases and debt default, creating a policy template that would be repeatedly deployed whenever government debt loads threatened fiscal sustainability. The systematic implementation of financial repression requires a precisely coordinated toolkit of policy instruments that operate simultaneously to create an inescapable environment where government debt receives preferential treatment at the expense of private savers. These mechanisms function as invisible levers that redirect the natural flow of capital away from market-determined outcomes toward government-controlled channels, creating artificial scarcity in investment alternatives while maintaining the illusion of free market operations. Understanding each component of this toolkit reveals how governments engineer captive audiences for their debt securities, while systematically suppressing the returns available to ordinary citizens seeking to preserve their purchasing power through traditional savings vehicles. Interest rate manipulation represents the foundational element of financial repression, operating through central bank policies that artificially suppress yields across the entire spectrum of fixed income investments. During the classic post-war implementation period, Federal Reserve officials maintained long-term government bond yields at precisely 2.5%, regardless of underlying inflation pressures or economic growth rates, effectively placing a ceiling on returns available throughout the financial system. This rate suppression extended beyond government securities into bank deposit rates, corporate bond yields, and mortgage rates, creating a controlled interest rate environment where savers could not escape artificially low returns by switching between different types of fixed income investments. Central banks accomplished this manipulation through direct market intervention, purchasing government bonds whenever yields threatened to rise above predetermined levels, while simultaneously signaling to financial markets that higher rates would not be tolerated. The creation of captive domestic debt holders constitutes the second critical component, achieved through regulatory mandates that force financial institutions to purchase government securities rather than seeking higher returns in private markets. Banking regulations required commercial banks to hold substantial reserves in government bonds, while insurance companies faced investment restrictions that channeled policyholder premiums into Treasury securities. Pension funds discovered their investment options constrained by fiduciary rules that favoured government bonds over potentially superior private sector alternatives, effectively conscripting retirement savings into government debt financing. These regulatory frameworks ensured that the largest pools of domestic capital had no choice but to accept suppressed government yields, creating guaranteed demand for Treasury securities regardless of their attractiveness relative to market alternatives. Capital flow restrictions and foreign exchange controls eliminated escape routes that might have allowed sophisticated investors to seek superior returns in international markets. Government authorities implemented currency controls that prevented large-scale capital flight, while maintaining the pretense of open financial markets, ensuring that domestic savings could not migrate to countries offering real positive returns on fixed income investments. These restrictions created geographic captivity for American wealth, forcing even affluent savers to accept domestically suppressed yields rather than pursuing opportunities in foreign markets where governments had not implemented similar financial repression policies. The deliberate cultivation of moderate inflation serves as the fourth essential instrument, operating in coordination with interest rate suppression to guarantee negative real returns across all traditional savings vehicles. Monetary authorities maintained inflationary policies that consistently exceeded nominal interest rates, ensuring that government debt could be repaid with currency possessing diminished purchasing power, while savers experienced steady erosion of their real wealth. This inflationary component distinguished financial repression from simple interest rate manipulation, creating a dual assault on saver purchasing power through both suppressed nominal returns and rising consumer prices. The coordinated deployment of these instruments creates a comprehensive wealth extraction system that operates as an invisible taxation mechanism, transferring resources from individual savers to government accounts without requiring legislative approval or generating public awareness. Financial institutions become unwilling partners in this system, compelled by regulatory requirements to channel customer deposits into government debt while offering returns that consistently trail inflation. The resulting environment systematically favors borrowers over savers, debt issuers over creditors, and government financing over private capital formation, fundamentally altering the risk-reward calculations that guide individual financial decisions. The systematic implementation of financial repression extends far beyond American borders, revealing itself as a deliberately coordinated global strategy deployed by governments worldwide whenever debt burdens threaten fiscal sustainability. This pattern emerges with striking consistency across advanced economies, developing nations, and emerging markets, demonstrating that financial repression represents not an isolated policy experiment, but rather a fundamental tool of modern statecraft, employed whenever traditional debt management approaches prove politically or economically unfeasible. The recurring nature of these episodes across diverse economic systems and time periods exposes financial repression as a calculated design rather than an accidental convergence of policy mistakes, revealing how governments systematically prioritize debt reduction over saver protection when confronting fiscal crises. The United Kingdom's post-war financial repression campaign represents perhaps the most extreme example of coordinated wealth extraction from private savers in modern economic history. British government debt exceeded 200% of gross domestic product following World War II, creating a financial burden so massive that conventional debt management strategies appeared wholly inadequate. British authorities responded by implementing a comprehensive financial repression framework that maintained negative real interest rates for approximately 48% of all years between 1945 and 1980, systematically transferring wealth from individual savers to government accounts through suppressed yields and deliberate inflation. British savers experienced decades of purchasing power erosion as government policies prioritised debt liquidation over real return preservation, demonstrating the willingness of democratic governments to sacrifice citizen wealth for fiscal convenience. American financial repression operated with slightly more restraint, but achieved comparable wealth transfer results through targeted implementation during critical debt reduction periods. Approximately 25% of years between 1945 and 1980 qualified as liquidation years in the United States, with negative real interest rates transferring an average of 3.5% of gross domestic product annually from private savers to government debt reduction. This systematic wealth extraction mechanism enabled American authorities to reduce debt burdens without implementing politically devastating tax increases or admitting fiscal insolvency through default, establishing financial repression as the preferred alternative to both aggressive taxation and debt restructuring. Emerging market economies demonstrate even more aggressive financial repression implementation, with some nations maintaining negative real interest rates for virtually their entire modern economic history. Argentina provides the most extreme example of sustained financial repression, with 97% of years in available data samples qualifying as liquidation years where government debt benefited from negative real interest rates at the expense of domestic savers. India, Italy, and numerous other developing economies relied heavily on financial repression to manage chronic debt problems, creating financial systems where real positive returns on traditional savings vehicles became virtually impossible to achieve. These emerging market examples reveal how financial repression can become a permanent feature of economic policy rather than a temporary crisis response measure. The cross-national consistency of financial repression implementation reveals a deliberate policy template that governments deploy with mathematical precision whenever debt burdens threaten political stability. Each episode follows an identical sequence of debt accumulation, real yield suppression, inflationary tolerance, domestic capital channeling, and wealth transfer from savers to government accounts, while maintaining the pretense of market-driven financial outcomes. This pattern recognition demonstrates that financial repression represents a conscious choice by government authorities to sacrifice individual purchasing power for fiscal stability, revealing how democratic institutions systematically favor debt management over citizen wealth protection when forced to choose between competing priorities. The international scope of financial repression implementation exposes the coordinated nature of these policies, suggesting knowledge transfer and policy coordination between governments facing similar fiscal challenges. This global pattern validates concerns about systematic wealth extraction mechanisms operating across supposedly independent financial markets, revealing how government authorities worldwide have adopted identical approaches to transferring private wealth into public debt relief through the sophisticated manipulation of interest rate environments and inflationary policies. The contemporary United States finds itself trapped within a debt spiral that mirrors the exact conditions that triggered massive financial repression campaigns throughout the 20th century. Yet the infrastructure for systematic wealth extraction from private savers has evolved into a far more sophisticated and comprehensive system than anything previously deployed in American economic history. Federal government debt obligations now exceed $35 trillion, representing approximately 140% of gross domestic product, and creating a fiscal burden that surpasses even the post-World War II debt crisis that launched the original financial repression era. This staggering debt load occurs simultaneously with the Federal Reserve maintaining near zero interest rate policies, banking system regulatory frameworks that channel institutional capital toward Treasury securities, and monetary policies that tolerate persistent inflation while suppressing real returns across all traditional savings vehicles. The modern financial repression apparatus operates through Federal Reserve policies that artificially suppress interest rates throughout the yield curve, creating negative real returns that systematically transfer wealth from individual savers to government debt reduction. Current Treasury yields frequently fall below measured inflation rates, generating negative real interest rates that mirror the debt liquidation periods of the 1950s and 60s, while affecting a much larger pool of private wealth through expanded financial market participation. Banking regulations require financial institutions to maintain substantial reserves in Treasury securities, while deposit insurance programs create moral hazard that encourages banks to prioritize government debt purchases over private sector lending. Pension funds and insurance companies face regulatory pressures that channel retirement savings and policyholder premiums into government bonds, regardless of their attractiveness relative to inflation-adjusted alternatives. The mathematical implications of applying even modest negative real interest rates to the current $35 trillion debt burden reveal the enormous scale of wealth transfer occurring from private savers to government accounts. A sustained negative real interest rate environment of merely 1% annually would reduce the government's debt servicing burden by approximately $350 billion each year, representing wealth extracted directly from the purchasing power of savings accounts, government bonds, certificates of deposit, and pension funds. Over a decade of such policies, this mechanism would transfer approximately $3.5 trillion from individual savers to government debt relief, demonstrating how financial repression scales mathematically with the size of outstanding debt obligations. Contemporary savers face a systematically rigged environment where traditional safe investments have been deliberately engineered to lose purchasing power while maintaining the illusion of positive returns through nominal interest payments. Retirees discover their fixed income portfolios steadily eroding in real terms as treasury yields remain below inflation rates, while bank depositors experience negative real returns despite receiving regular interest credits that fail to maintain purchasing power against rising consumer prices. Pension beneficiaries find their retirement security undermined by portfolio managers forced to accept government yields that guarantee real losses over extended time periods, creating a systematic transfer of retirement wealth from individual accounts to federal debt reduction. The current system represents the culmination of decades of regulatory and monetary policy development, designed to create captive audiences for government debt, while eliminating escape routes for sophisticated savers. Capital markets have become thoroughly dominated by institutional investors, subject to regulatory mandates favoring Treasury securities, while individual investors face limited alternatives that provide genuine inflation protection without assuming unacceptable risks. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expansion through quantitative easing programs has created artificial demand for government bonds, while suppressing yields across all fixed income categories, ensuring that even corporate bonds and municipal securities offer inadequate protection against deliberate inflationary policies. Modern financial repression operates as a comprehensive wealth extraction system that transfers resources from individual savers to government accounts while maintaining democratic legitimacy through the absence of visible tax increases or dramatic policy announcements, creating the perfect mechanism for systematic purchasing power confiscation without generating political resistance. The convergence of historical precedent with contemporary monetary conditions creates an undeniable pattern that exposes financial repression as the deliberate mechanism through which the United States government plans to liquidate its $35 trillion debt burden by systematically extracting wealth from ordinary savers over the next 2 decades. Every institutional framework necessary for comprehensive financial repression now operates at maximum capacity, from Federal Reserve interest rate manipulation that maintains yields below inflation rates, to banking regulations that force institutional capital into Treasury securities regardless of their real return characteristics. The mathematical precision with which these policies align with historical debt liquidation campaigns reveals a coordinated strategy designed to transfer approximately $4 to $5 trillion from private savings to government debt reduction through the engineered erosion of purchasing power across all traditional fixed income investments. Current economic indicators demonstrate that financial repression implementation has already achieved critical mass throughout the American financial system. Federal funds rates remain artificially suppressed near 0%, while consumer price inflation accelerates beyond 3% annually, creating negative real interest rates that mirror the debt liquidation years of the 1950s and 60s. Central bank balance sheet expansion through quantitative easing programs has created artificial demand for government securities, while simultaneously suppressing yields on corporate bonds, municipal debt, and private sector alternatives that might otherwise provide inflation protection for individual investors. Banking system reserves increasingly consist of treasury securities rather than private sector loans, demonstrating how regulatory frameworks channel domestic capital away from productive investment toward government debt financing. The inevitable conclusion emerging from this systematic policy coordination predicts that traditional safe investments will continue losing purchasing power at accelerating rates as government debt service requirements demand ever greater wealth extraction from private savers. Savings accounts, certificates of deposit, treasury bonds, and conservative pension portfolios face mathematically certain real losses as long as inflation exceeds nominal interest rates, while alternative investments offering genuine inflation protection become increasingly scarce and expensive. Retirees depending on fixed income returns will discover their purchasing power steadily eroding despite receiving regular interest payments, while younger savers will find traditional wealth accumulation strategies systematically undermined by policies designed to prioritize government debt management over individual financial security. Recognition of this wealth extraction mechanism requires fundamental reconsideration of investment strategies that assume government securities provide genuine safety for long-term purchasing power preservation. Real safety now demands assets that maintain value during inflationary periods, rather than nominal safety that preserves dollar amounts while losing purchasing power, forcing savers to abandon traditional fixed income allocations in favor of inflation-resistant alternatives. Physical assets, equity positions in companies with pricing power, international investments beyond regulatory reach, and alternative stores of value become essential components of defensive portfolios designed to resist systematic purchasing power confiscation through financial repression policies. The current environment represents a historically unprecedented wealth transfer system operating under the guise of monetary policy normalization, while systematically favoring government debt service over individual saver protection. Banking institutions, pension funds, insurance companies, and individual investors have become unwilling participants in a coordinated debt liquidation campaign that prioritizes fiscal stability over purchasing power preservation, creating conditions where traditional financial advice becomes actively harmful to long-term wealth preservation. The era of assuming that conservative investments provide genuine safety has permanently ended, replaced by a system designed to extract real wealth from savers while maintaining the illusion of market-driven returns. Understanding this mechanism represents the essential first step toward protecting individual wealth from systematic government confiscation through the sophisticated deployment of financial repression policies that operate as invisible taxation on anyone foolish enough to trust that their savings will maintain purchasing power under current monetary and regulatory frameworks.